Good morning. I hope that you are doing well and coping with all the challenges that this current time is throwing at us. Today, we're finishing off our series of talks looking at the fantastic book of Peter. Some people have been reading the readings each day with the YouVersion app. Personally, I've enjoyed reading it in one go and then looking at different sections in our small groups. And as I've been looking at it, three key themes have stood out to me to show us what kind of people the Apostle Peter is asking the early Christians to become. Peter is calling on those early Christians to be holy, to be humble, and to be hopeful. Holy, humble, and hopeful. I think that's the mark that we are asked to leave on the world as we follow Christ. Now, if you've joined us in any of our online recent sermon series, you'll have heard how Peter writes this letter to Christians who are suffering some incredible persecution, which was started by the Emperor Nero. Some Christians were simply imprisoned for their faith, some were thrown into the lion's den, literally, and some were slaughtered, while others died in horrific circumstances, even by Roman standards. And into that backdrop of suffering and persecution, the entire family of believers, as the phrase is used here, were experiencing persecution and rejection. And Peter writes to encourage the early Christian church and to guide them how to behave and how to live lives that reflect the love and character of Jesus in terrible circumstances. But this book is not just a history book. It's absolutely relevant to us today as well. Many of us have been suffering in different ways, in our families, in our communities, and in wider society. Now, I know the situation is not quite the same. I mean, homeschooling is tough, but it's not the same as being fed to the lions. I recognize that. Back-to-back Zoom meetings does get tiring, but we aren't going to be thrown into jail because of them. Many of us have been struggling or suffering or know people who have been with their health, with isolation, with jobs, with their finances, with worry and doubt and concern. And I think Peter's encouragement to live holy, humble, and hopeful lives speaks into our situation even today. So let's start by looking at holy. I mean, we are called to live holy lives, to holy living. And we've had talks about this over the last few weeks, which have covered this topic. Peter encourages the believers to be holy 6 times in this letter. He says things like, be holy, be a holy priesthood, and be a holy nation. And the word holy means set apart for God's purposes. Chapter 2 is particularly focused on how to live a holy life in a society that's messed up. But we also see it here in chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. And to be holy means to be connected to God, created for God's purposes. In the Old Testament of the Bible, when God gave instructions about making the temple, some things were made holy and they were dedicated for a specific purpose in worship, which I always think of as a bit like having the best china set aside and it's only to be used if the Queen comes for dinner. That's how the Old Testament viewed some holy items. But the model of holiness that we see in Jesus is one where God is holy and God comes into the world to make it holy, which is a bit like adding squash to water to make the whole water taste different. Jesus pours out his holiness to make all of creation different. And so the call of Peter to be holy, like Jesus, is wrapped up in our behavior. Being holy is not a concept or an idea, but it's a call to action, to live our lives as a living example of the risen Jesus Christ, not pursuing dishonest gain, not lording it over other people, living as examples to the flock, as it says in our reading. Over this COVID crisis, there have been many negative examples of individuals and organizations exploiting the situation. And there's no surprise there. We live in a fallen world. But thankfully, there are many examples of amazing individual behavior where people are trying to make the world around them a better place. We heard Sangeeta recently talking to us about hospital workers staying in hotels to reduce the risk to their families. We've heard of people shopping for those in need, providing accommodation for those on the street. And I can't help but think of the fantastic work that the organisation yourneighbour.org has been involved in, which our very own Ed Perry is heavily involved in leading and setting up. And that's where churches have worked together at a national, a local, and an individual level to show what it means to live as an example of Jesus Christ. Because, you see, the holiness that we see in Jesus was not detached from the world. It wasn't that setting things apart and putting it on the shelf for a special occasion type of holiness that we might have read about in the Old Testament. It's a holiness that is immersed in the world, changing the world through Jesus's actions and presence. Peter says in chapter 1, verse 15, "Just as he who called you is holy, be holy." And I can't help but think about the impact. I mean, just imagine the impact it would have on our community if we set out every day, if our first intention was to be holy like Jesus. But it's hard. I mean, it's almost impossible. Only Jesus managed it. But still, he calls us to aim for it. The challenge to follow Jesus and be holy is something we all fail at. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Now, Peter knows about failure, so he speaks humbly. In chapter 5, verse 6, Peter says, "Humble yourselves under God's mighty hand." But there's more than just one verse on it. Peter also asks us to be shepherds of God's flock, to be clothed with humility, to follow Jesus's example of humility. And Peter actually shows us what humility is like. At the beginning of chapter 5, in verse 1, Peter says, "I appeal as a fellow elder," which is quite remarkable, really. I mean, this is Peter, who lived and breathed and ate and talked with Jesus in person. But Peter humbly appeals and doesn't lord it over others. He doesn't say, "You know what Jesus said to me one day when we were just hanging out, just me and him, you know." And he also doesn't say, "You remember when Jesus said, 'I'll build my church on you'? He was talking about me and you're the church. So would you just do what I'm telling you to do?" Peter doesn't make himself anything more than us. Peter humbly urges us, he encourages us, he appeals to us to try to be holy, even though he knows we will fail, because everybody fails. Because when Peter looks in the mirror, he sees a failed follower who is humbly aware of his need of a saviour. I remember several years ago talking with a friend of mine who didn't go to church, but we were talking about going to church. And he said, "I can't stand it. It's full of self-righteous people who think they're perfect." And I was so saddened that Christians had given him that impression. I was so sad that he experienced people for whom humility was simply a concept and not a practice. Jesus was the Son of God, and yet he behaved like a servant. And not just a servant to fancy people, but a servant to everyday common people. Jesus didn't say, "Do you know who I am? Do you know what my Father does? He didn't say, you wouldn't believe what I've given up for you to be here now. I mean, if you knew what I was gonna do for you. Not at all. Jesus displayed humility every day, putting others first, setting aside his own self-interest, his own desire, his own life, putting his own wishes to one side to put the world's needs first. Peter encourages us to be shepherds of God's flock, just like he saw Jesus being. Not because we have to be, we must, but because we are willing. Shepherds of the flock that humbly care for people's need, putting others before ourselves, setting our wishes, opinions, and needs aside to put others first and foremost. Not as a concept or an idea, but as a practical expression. And just so you're in no doubt that I'm a failed follower, just like Peter, I want you to know that I struggle hugely with this, mainly in my thinking. You know, I sit back in my head and judge situations and people's behavior every single day. When I've been at Sainsbury's doing our shopping, trying to keep my distance, and someone just leans right across me, coughing in my face, I see red and think, what the? Well, you know, I'm not being humble in those moments. I'm being self-centered, self-righteous, and thinking I'm perfect, or at least I know better, I am better than them. And for people like me, Peter gives a reality check, a warning, and he says, God opposes the proud. And that hits hard if you apply it to your own behavior. I mean, try reading that bit in verse 5, which is actually a quote from Proverbs. God opposes the proud, but gives favor to the humble. Try reading that with your name and behavior in it. God opposes you, Dale, when you criticize the behavior of others, and he gives favor to those who act humbly towards them. Holy and humble, striving with all our effort to be holy like Jesus, by putting others first and serving their needs before ours. Humbly recognizing that we fail. But if we did just that, striving and failing, it probably wouldn't lead us to a great place, and we'd end up feeling like a failure, which is why we need hope. We need to be hopeful people, as well as holy and humble people. And Peter gives us two aspects of hope here. Verse 4 says, you will receive a crown of glory that will never fade. That's a kind of future eternity hope. In the future, we'll get something from God that will never spoil or fade. Future hope is inspiring. Those who love and follow Jesus will get a future crown of glory, everlasting life with him, a future that is perfect and unending. But Peter also covers hope for the present day, hope in the here and now. Present day hope where we can cast all our anxiety on him, on God, because he, God, cares for you. Or as it says later, resist him, the devil, standing firm in the faith. Christ himself will restore you and make you strong and steadfast. These are all examples of the present day hope we can experience as we're aiming for holy and working humbly. That we can have hope in the moment and the future of God's active presence with us. I don't know what you're hoping for at the moment. It may be practical, it may be emotional, it may be something to do with relationships in your life. Or maybe it's just simply that, like me, you need a lockdown haircut. But Jesus wants to bring some of that eternal hope into our present day-to-day experience. Jesus wants to transform our everyday existence by immersing our lives in the presence of his holiness. And he gives us encouraging hope that as we resist falling into line with the world's standards, we stand strong. And we're not alone in that struggle to stand up and be holy in a fallen world. It's a struggle that all the believers across the world are experiencing at the same time. So, in summary, I think of this holiness, humility, and hope. I think of it that Peter talks about here. They're built on the foundation of fixing our gaze on Jesus, God made flesh. I think that's what Peter is trying to do throughout this fantastic letter here. He's trying to help us see the reality of the Jesus that he saw, that he lived and breathed with and ate with. He saw that Jesus was holy, but that the holiness didn't set him apart and make him separate and kept on a shelf for a special occasion. Rather, it transformed existence by mixing with the lowest. Peter actually saw that Jesus was humble in putting the needs of the lowest people of the time before his. By laying aside his privilege and majesty to be with us, he saw that Jesus gave hope of eternity to people and the hope of his presence with people day to day. So if you believe in Jesus, if you call yourself a Christian, you are called to live a life that is holy and to live that life humbly and to have a hope, a future hope and a day-to-day hope that comes from knowing God's presence. As a church and as individuals who want to follow Jesus more effectively, I want to encourage us all to set our intention on living holy lives in a humble way that will transform our day-to-day experience and the world around us, bringing the hope of eternity into our day-to-day reality. Holy, humble, and hopeful are the characteristics that we are called to display as we live out our lives for Jesus, individually and together as one church. Thank you.